A billionaire CEO laughed when a black janitor claimed he could fix a $2 million engine that MIT engineers had failed 67 times. She mocked him in front of 200 people, live-streamed it to the world, and then watched in horror as he did the impossible. The boardroom at Tech Vanguard looked more like a cathedral of glass and steel than a place for business. 20 executives and investors sat around a polished mahogany table that gleamed under recessed lighting. In the center, like a wounded animal on display, lay the company's crown jewel, a $2 million autonomous vehicle engine that had refused to run for more than 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Its chrome casing caught the light like a mirror, reflecting the anxious faces of men and women who had staked their reputations on its success. At the head of the table stood Victoria Sterling, CEO, blonde hair pulled tight in her signature bun, tailored crimson suit radiating authority. She wasn't just a business leader, she was the queen of this glass tower, and everyone in the room knew it. When the door creaked open, the sound was almost sacrilegious. Jamal Washington froze on the threshold, one hand gripping the handle of his maintenance cart, the other clutching a pair of overstuffed trash bags. He hadn't been invited. He never was. His job was to glide through these polished floors unseen, like a shadow, cleaning up the remains of coffee cups and half-eaten pastries that marked the war rooms of Silicon Valley's elite. Victoria turned, and her eyes locked on him. Her nose wrinkled as if the very smell of him offended her. With a dramatic gesture, she lifted a silk handkerchief to her face and waved the air as though warding off the stench of motor oil. "God, you even smell like the garage," she said, her voice dripping with venom. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved around the table. Jamal shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the grease stains on his coveralls, the calluses on his hands, the way 20 pairs of eyes pinned him like he was a stray mutt that had wandered into a banquet hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria continued, raising her voice for maximum effect. "Our janitor believes he belongs in the same room as visionaries and investors. How charming." She began to walk toward him, heels striking the marble floor in sharp, deliberate clicks. Each step seemed to echo with disdain. When she stopped in front of him, the room went utterly silent. Jamal could smell her perfume, expensive, floral, laced with the unmistakable undertone of contempt. She leaned so close he could see her diamond bracelet sparkle as she lifted a manicured hand and snapped her fingers inches from his face. "Here's a deal, maintenance boy," she said, her words slicing the air. "Fix this engine, this $2 million marvel that MIT engineers, Stanford prodigies, and Harvard graduates have failed to repair. Do it right here, right now, and I'll marry you on the spot." The audacity of the statement sucked the air out of the room. 20 jaws went slack, 20 sets of eyes widened. Investors shifted in their chairs, uncertain whether to laugh or recoil. Marry him? The very idea sounded like a cruel joke, the kind meant to reduce a man into dust before he even dared respond. Victoria's lips curled into a smile sharp enough to draw blood. "But when you fail, and you will, security will escort you out. Permanently. No more trash bags, no more janitor's cart, no more pretending you belong in this building." Her words were a guillotine blade, raised and waiting. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Jamal stood frozen, trash bags sagging in his grip, the weight of humiliation pressing down on his shoulders. To the board, he was less than an afterthought, a prop in the theater of Victoria Sterling's power. One investor coughed awkwardly, another sipped his espresso as if to mask a grin. The engine, gleaming and broken, sat between them all like a silent judge, daring anyone to challenge its defiance. Victoria turned back toward the table, satisfied that her little spectacle had landed. She gestured dramatically at the machine, her diamond ring catching the boardroom light like a signal flare. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of performance. "If this janitor succeeds, I will bind my reputation, my company, even my hand in marriage to his so-called genius. But if he fails, and failure is inevitable, consider this his final day under this roof." She let the words linger, savoring the effect. In the corner of the room, 2 security guards exchanged glances, already anticipating the show they'd be called to finish. The air was thick with disbelief and a twisted kind of excitement. The executives leaned forward, the investors straightened in their seats, and Jamal, still clutching those bags of trash, realized that, in one cruel instant, he had become the center of a spectacle designed to break him. What no one yet understood was that this humiliation, this moment meant to bury him, had just lit the fuse of a story that would shake the entire building to its glass foundations. The glass tower of Tech Vanguard rose 40 stories above the sprawl of Silicon Valley, a monument of steel and ambition that glimmered like a beacon of innovation. Every morning, fleets of Teslas and Porsches lined the marble entrance, their doors opening to release young engineers in tailored suits who carried laptops worth more than Jamal Washington's monthly rent. These were the chosen, the credentialed elite, armed with Ivy League diplomas and resumes polished to perfection. They swiped their badges through biometric scanners, exchanging nods of recognition and murmurs of algorithms, never once glancing at the man pushing a rattling maintenance cart through the lobby. Jamal moved like a shadow through the cathedral of glass. His coveralls bore the faint scent of cleaning chemicals and engine grease, a scent that made executives wrinkle their noses before they even realized he was there. The polished wheels of his cart squeaked across marble floors that reflected the fluorescent lights above like holy fire. Every day he emptied trash cans overflowing with half-eaten sushi and artisanal coffee cups, the discarded fuel of billion-dollar dreams. And every day he was invisible, a necessary ghost whose presence was acknowledged only when something sticky clung to the floor or when fluorescent bulbs burned out. Behind closed doors, the executives spoke of market share, patents, and partnerships. On the other side of those doors, Jamal listened to the hum of ventilation systems and the whispers of engines, the one language he'd never forgotten. For 3 years he had walked those halls, treated as furniture, yet no one realized that behind the silence lived an education, a history, a brilliance dimmed not by lack of talent, but by the cruel arithmetic of survival. In a cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of San Jose, a framed certificate still hung crooked on a peeling wall. Associate of Science in Mechanical Engineering, Community College of Detroit. The paper had cost him sleepless nights and 3 jobs, but to him it was priceless. To Tech Vanguard, it was irrelevant. While his classmates transferred to 4-year universities, chasing internships at Tesla or SpaceX, Jamal stayed home. His mother's chemotherapy sessions cost $3,000 each. Insurance covered 60%. The math was merciless. He could either chase his dream or keep her alive. So he worked nights at a gas station, weekends at an auto parts store, mornings cleaning office buildings, all while studying torque ratios and combustion cycles under flickering library lights. His grades never wavered. Professors marveled at the way he seemed to hear engines rather than study them. But fate doesn't always reward brilliance. The bills piled higher, the hospital visits multiplied, and Jamal's applications to universities remained sealed in a folder labeled Someday. That someday never came. Instead, he walked into Tech Vanguard through a temp agency that promised technical consultant opportunities. The title sounded prestigious, almost worthy of his effort, but the reality was simple. He pushed a cart, emptied bins, and mopped the same floors where PhDs debated artificial intelligence over catered lunches. The cruelest part wasn't the labor. It was the way they looked through him as if he were made of glass. Executives stepped around him mid-conversation, never pausing, never breaking stride. Engineers left blueprints scattered across conference tables, confident the janitor wouldn't understand the equations scrawled across them. They were wrong. At night, long after the offices went dark, Jamal lingered. He picked up those abandoned blueprints and studied them with the reverence of a priest reading sacred scripture. He ran his fingers across diagrams of pistons and AI calibration codes, tracing the flaws no one else seemed to notice. While others slept, he cross-referenced those patterns with the knowledge his grandfather had drilled into him in Detroit garages. Machines had voices. They cried, groaned, and whispered their pain. The problem was that no one at Tech Vanguard knew how to listen. Jamal knew. He had always known. His grandfather Samuel had placed his small hands on engine blocks when he was 12 years old, teaching him that a misaligned piston sang a different note, that a failing gasket carried a scent like burnt almonds, that harmony and chaos lived inside every machine. Those lessons didn't require an Ivy League education. They required ears that listened, hands that felt, and a soul willing to respect steel as if it were alive. In the glossy corridors of Tech Vanguard, those lessons seemed absurd. What mattered here were credentials, pedigree, and the right kind of suit. Jamal had none of those. What he did have was calloused hands, sleepless eyes, and an instinct sharpened by years of sacrifice. Every morning he carried his mother's words with him. You may not have the title, but you have the gift. Don't let them take that from you. He whispered it silently while mopping floors as executives laughed behind glass walls, while security guards checked his ID twice just to remind him of his place, while Victoria Sterling paraded him as a token of corporate charity. In their world, he was a janitor. In truth, he was an engineer in exile, a man with knowledge buried under trash bags and mop buckets, invisible to everyone who mattered. But invisibility has a way of preparing someone for the moment when the spotlight finally, inevitably, swings their way. And when it did, the world would learn that Jamal Washington wasn't just another shadow in the glass tower. He was the one man who had been listening all along. The laboratories of Tech Vanguard glowed under cold blue light, rows of servers humming like restless insects as engineers in $1,000 suits stared at screens filled with error codes. The engine sat in its glass chamber, a silent adversary mocking them with every failed attempt. For 6 weeks they had labored, cycling through diagnostics, rewriting lines of code, swapping hardware. And each time the result was the same. At exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds, the engine would overheat, shut down, and display the same cryptic message: harmonic disruption detected. 67 times they had tried, 67 times the machine had defeated them. The cost of failure escalated like a fire consuming oxygen. 10 million in consulting fees became 30, 30 ballooned into 67, and every passing day saw investors grow colder. Victoria Sterling tracked the losses with a fury that echoed through marble corridors. Her voice carried through the labs like a storm warning, tearing into teams who had once been the pride of Ivy League institutions. MIT graduates with framed diplomas now sat hunched, dark circles under their eyes, too terrified to admit they were lost. Stanford prodigies whispered half-baked theories between sips of stale coffee, while Harvard engineers rehearsed excuses that sounded more like prayers. None of it mattered. The numbers did not lie. The engine would not obey. In Berlin, Autotech Bavaria had begun to reconsider their investment. Klaus Mueller's delegation had not crossed an ocean to watch failure unfold like theater. They expected precision, results, dominance. Instead, they watched a room full of supposed geniuses fold under pressure. Victoria felt the weight of their stares like knives. She needed a scapegoat. During one particularly disastrous meeting, smoke still hanging in the air from a failed ignition test, Victoria slammed her manicured fist against the conference table. The sound echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot, silencing the exhausted engineers. $67 million, she hissed, eyes sweeping across the room. That is what we have burned chasing ghosts. 67 million that could have bought us dominance in 3 major cities. And what do I see? Excuses. Excuses from people who swore they were the best in the world. The room sat in suffocating silence. Laptops glowed with meaningless lines of code, graphs spiking red like flatlining heart monitors. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Someone else coughed. Victoria's gaze moved like a searchlight hunting prey until it settled on the one man who had no voice in this room. Jamal, standing in the corner with his water pitcher, waiting to refill glasses no one would drink. Her lips curled. Maybe the problem, she said, loud enough for every investor to hear, is that we have too many people who don't belong here. Dead weight dragging down this operation. Heads turned, as though the accusation might materialize into a target, and it did. All eyes slid toward Jamal. He felt the heat of their judgment burn against his skin. He wasn't part of the meeting, yet suddenly he was its centerpiece. A man who emptied trash bags now framed as the embodiment of failure. Some of the engineers lowered their eyes in shame, unwilling to participate in the cruelty. Others let their exhaustion twist into agreement. After all, blaming the janitor was easier than admitting their own incompetence. Jamal did what he always did. He stayed silent, eyes fixed on the condensation dripping down the side of the water pitcher, hands steady even as his dignity was chipped away piece by piece. He had learned long ago that survival in places like this meant invisibility, but invisibility also had its price. Victoria pressed her advantage. We've allowed charity to replace competence, she sneered. A company on the brink of revolution should not waste resources on distractions. Her words hung heavy in the sterile air, dripping with contempt. The German investors shifted in their seats, their expressions unreadable but their silence damning. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest. He could have spoken. He could have reminded them that he held an engineering certificate, that he had studied systems more closely than most of the people in that room. But what would it have mattered? In their eyes, he was the man with the mop, the disposable shadow. And so he lowered his gaze and let the humiliation pass over him like a storm he could not stop. Yet in the hum of machines, in the rhythm of the failing engine, Jamal heard something the others missed. To him, the shutdown wasn't a mystery. It was a pattern, a voice straining against itself, like an orchestra out of tune. He tucked that thought away, silent, waiting. Victoria ended the meeting with a glare sharp enough to slice steel. "Failure is not an option," she spat. "If we cannot solve this by week's end, we lose everything." The executives filed out in silence, their polished shoes clicking against marble floors. The investors lingered, whispering in clipped German syllables, their patience fraying. And Jamal, once again, was left standing alone in the wreckage of their failure, painted as the scapegoat of a crisis he hadn't created. What no one realized was that by pointing the finger at him, Victoria had unknowingly shifted the spotlight. The janitor she sought to humiliate would soon become the very center of the drama she could no longer control. The hum of the engine in Tech Vanguard's sterile lab carried a sound no one else seemed to notice. To the engineers, it was just data, numbers blinking on screens, graphs spiking red. To Jamal, standing silently with his mop and bucket, it was something else, a voice, a rhythm. And in that moment, the sound pulled him backward through time, away from glass towers and cold fluorescent light, into the warmth of a garage in Detroit, 1995. The smell of motor oil and steel hung thick in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of his grandmother's cornbread drifting from the kitchen. A Mustang sat half dismantled on concrete blocks, its hood raised like a wounded beast awaiting rescue. Samuel Washington, Jamal's grandfather, moved with deliberate grace around the machine. His coveralls were stained, his hands dark and weathered, but when they touched metal, they carried authority that no degree could manufacture. Samuel had been the first black foreman at Ford Motor Company in the 1970s, a man who had broken barriers with skill so undeniable that even prejudice had to step aside. At 72, his back bent slightly but his eyes still burned with fire. "Come here, boy," Samuel called, not looking up as he traced the Mustang's engine block with his fingers. 12-year-old Jamal approached, wide-eyed, wiping grease onto his jeans. He loved these afternoons. Hours stolen from video games and schoolyard chatter, traded for something far greater, the language of machines. Samuel took Jamal's small hand and placed it gently on the vibrating surface of the engine. "Feel that?" he said. "That's a heartbeat. Every engine's got one. Listen close. It'll tell you if it's hurting." Jamal closed his eyes, concentrating. At first he felt only the steady thrum of machinery. But then he began to notice the irregularities, the uneven rhythm, the faint clatter out of sync with the rest. "It's fighting itself," Samuel explained, his voice steady, patient. "The cylinders aren't talking right. You don't need a computer to know that. You need respect. Respect the machine and it'll never lie to you." Those words etched themselves into Jamal's soul. In that garage filled with the ghosts of Motown industry, Samuel taught him that engines were not just parts and diagrams, they were living symphonies of steel and fire. Pistons were percussion, valves the wind section, the crankshaft a conductor uniting them all. When harmony faltered, the whole piece unraveled. Samuel's lessons were more than mechanical, they were survival. "White folks gonna test you twice as hard," he would say, wiping sweat from his brow. "They'll assume you're half as smart. But engines don't care about your skin. Fix what they couldn't, and suddenly the color of your hands doesn't matter. The machine speaks truth no one can deny." Jamal absorbed every word, every vibration, every smell of oil and smoke. By 16, he could rebuild entire engines blindfolded, diagnosing faults not with scanners, but with intuition honed under Samuel's watchful eye. While other kids bragged about video game scores, Jamal bragged about bringing dead engines back to life. The garage became his cathedral, the steady thrum of machinery his hymns, the spark of combustion his stained glass. But lessons like these carried shadows too. Samuel knew the cost of brilliance ignored. He had lived it, decades of being underestimated, decades of proving himself over and over, until finally respect had been forced from those who once doubted him. That torch was passed to Jamal. The day Samuel collapsed, wrench still in hand, his legacy fell heavy on his grandson's shoulders. Jamal had cried in that garage, his palm pressed against cold steel that no longer vibrated, whispering promises to keep listening, to keep respecting. Now, years later, in a high-tech lab thousands of miles away, Jamal heard the same language. The sterile walls and glowing monitors meant nothing. The heartbeat of the engine spoke louder than data. It was straining, out of tune, crying for someone who understood. Invisibility had silenced him for years, but in that moment, the memory of Samuel's hand on his own gave him strength. Jamal's eyes lifted from the mop bucket to the gleaming machine. He remembered the words like scripture: "An engine doesn't care about your diploma. It only responds to those who listen." In that memory lay the secret no one else could see, the bridge between Detroit's grease-stained wisdom and Silicon Valley's billion-dollar crisis. The auditorium of Tech Vanguard was packed, 200 employees crammed shoulder to shoulder under the glare of fluorescent lights. The German investors occupied the front row, their designer suits catching the glow of the stage, their faces carved in stone. Klaus Müller sat in the center, his reputation for precision radiating like an aura, while beside him, Dr. Elena Rodriguez scribbled calm notes in a leather-bound journal. Everyone knew this gathering wasn't routine. It was a reckoning. On stage, Victoria Sterling gripped the microphone, her poise restored by sheer force of will. Behind her, the massive projection screens displayed the gleaming but broken engine, a reminder of 6 weeks of humiliation. She raised her chin, determined to reclaim control. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing in the acoustics, "our revolutionary system remains non-operational. Our best minds have failed. Effective immediately. Cost reductions will begin, non-essential positions will be eliminated." A ripple of dread passed through the crowd. People exchanged fearful glances. Somewhere in the back, Jamal Washington raised his hand. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but in the stillness it was noticed instantly. The microphone caught his words with perfect clarity. "Ma'am, I think the problem might be in the harmonic frequency calibration, not the software integration." The effect was electric. 200 heads swiveled toward the man who had spoken. Gasps escaped lips. The Germans leaned forward. Victoria froze, her face tightening as though slapped. A janitor had dared to interrupt her in front of investors worth 100 million euros. Rage sparked in her eyes, but then calculation replaced it. She saw an opportunity, not for victory, but for spectacle. "Well, well," she purred, her voice amplified, dripping with venom. "Maintenance consultant has a theory about advanced engineering. How delightful." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Employees shifted uncomfortably. They knew what this was: corporate blood sport. Victoria turned, gesturing dramatically toward the Germans like a magician unveiling her trick. "Here is your chance, Mr. Washington. You claim to understand what 67 Harvard and MIT graduates could not. Prove it. Fix our $2 million engine right here. In front of our board, our investors, and the entire company." She snapped her fingers, and the projection screens lit up with live feeds from multiple cameras. Tech Vanguard's social media team scrambled, hashtags already forming on company accounts. Within minutes, thousands would be watching this humiliation play out in real time. Victoria's smile gleamed sharp as glass. "You have exactly 2 hours. If you succeed, which we both know you won't, I will personally promote you to senior engineering consultant. If you fail, you will be escorted out by security and blacklisted from every tech company in Silicon Valley." The words struck like a hammer blow. Employees whispered, horrified. 2 security guards appeared at the side doors, their crossed arms a physical reminder of the stakes. Jamal stood motionless, his heart pounding, the weight of every eye crushing him. Victoria leaned close to the microphone, her whisper amplified to every corner of the room. "This will be entertaining." And then, a voice cut through the tension. "I'll serve as technical witness," said Dr. Elena Rodriguez. She rose from her seat with a grace that commanded silence. At 62, with 4 decades of engineering triumphs behind her, her presence was a force of nature. "This evaluation requires fairness. I will oversee the process to ensure accuracy." The entire room shifted. Suddenly, the challenge wasn't a farce. It was legitimate. Klaus Müller nodded, his steel-gray eyes unblinking. "Excellent," he said, his German accent precise. "We are curious to see American problem-solving methods." For the first time, Victoria's confident smile faltered. She hadn't expected Rodriguez to intervene. Her plan for an easy humiliation had turned into a public trial with real stakes. Still, she recovered quickly. "Fine," she snapped, though her tone carried an edge of frustration. "But let's raise the curtain properly. Tech Vanguard prides itself on transparency. We live stream this challenge on all our channels. Let the world see what happens when unqualified people attempt jobs beyond their capabilities." The stage transformed. Lighting crews adjusted spotlights. Cameras zoomed in on Jamal, capturing the janitor who dared to challenge Silicon Valley royalty. Employees leaned forward in their seats, phones already out, texting friends and posting updates. The entire auditorium vibrated with anticipation. Jamal drew a deep breath. his grandfather's words echoing in his memory. Respect the machine, and it will never lie to you. Looked toward the engine, then toward Dr. Rodriguez, who met his gaze with steady calm. Are you certain you want to proceed? She asked quietly, her voice for his ears alone. Jamal nodded. I've been listening to this engine for weeks. I think I understand what it's trying to say. She studied him for a moment, then spoke louder so the microphones carried her words to the crowd. Very well, let's see what you can do. And just like that, the challenge was set. 2 hours, a broken machine, a man everyone dismissed, and an entire world now watching to see if the janitor could do what geniuses could not. The executive boardroom no longer looked like a meeting space. It looked like an arena. The long conference table had been cleared, except for the gleaming carcass of the $2 million engine, its chrome body glinting under LED lights like a judge waiting to deliver a sentence. 200 employees pressed against the glass walls, faces forming a living mosaic of doubt and curiosity. At the far end, the German investors sat in leather chairs, their posture rigid, their eyes sharp. Klaus Müller checked his platinum watch with Germanic precision. Cameras on tripods captured every angle, streaming live to thousands across the internet. The comments section was already flooding with engineers, industry analysts, and gawking spectators hungry for a spectacle. And in the center of it all stood Jamal Washington, coveralls smeared with oil, calloused hands, steady against the weight of the moment. He approached the engine with the reverence of a man approaching an altar. The noise in the room died down until even the hum of the ventilation system sounded like thunder. Jamal placed both palms flat on the engine block and closed his eyes. To everyone else it looked absurd, a janitor pretending to commune with a machine. But Jamal wasn't pretending. He was listening. For 30 long seconds the room held its breath. The engineers smirked, whispering about theatrics. But Dr. Lina Rodriguez, standing just a few feet away, saw the change in Jamal's expression, concentration melting into recognition. It's fighting itself, he said suddenly, voice carrying clear across the acoustics. The words sliced through the murmurs, silencing even the skeptics. He opened his eyes and turned toward Klaus Müller. The AI system is perfect, but it's trying to compensate for mechanical problems that shouldn't exist. Mueller's brows arched with interest. Jamal gestured toward the diagnostic screens, glowing with incomprehensible graphs. Sir, this engine was manufactured in Munich to metric specifications, but the calibration software was written here in California using imperial measurements. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra when every instrument is tuned to a slightly different key. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Some engineers blinked, connecting dots they hadn't seen in 6 weeks. Victoria Sterling's smile twitched, the first crack in her mask of control. Jamal asked for permission to start the engine. Rodriguez nodded. Proceed. The ignition turned. The machine roared to life, filling the boardroom with deep mechanical thunder. To the untrained ear it sounded fine, but to Jamal it was a chorus out of sync, vibrations clashing like voices singing in different languages. He raised his voice above the rumble. At 2800 RPM, the pistons are at their natural rhythm, but the AI sensors are forcing them into an artificial pattern. The mismatch creates resonance that builds until it collapses at exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. He pointed to the oscilloscope where wave patterns danced erratically. You've been chasing software ghosts. The problem is harmonic, not digital. The room stirred. Marcus Brooks, the MIT team leader, stepped forward. Impossible. We tested harmonic frequencies. Jamal met his eyes respectfully. You tested what the AI expected, but the components themselves are playing a different song. He moved to the blueprints spread across the table. His fingers traced specifications with the ease of someone who had studied them in silence night after night. The crankshaft was machined in Munich to 87.63 millimeters. The AI calibration assumes 450 inches, 87.663 millimeters. On paper, they look identical. In reality, the tiny difference throws the whole system out of harmony. Dr. Rodriguez leaned in, her pen scribbling furiously. Klaus Müller rose halfway from his seat, German pride demanding verification. He checked the numbers himself, and after several long moments he nodded. Mathematically correct, he murmured. Jamal continued, confidence growing as instinct and memory fused into revelation. German manufacturing tolerances are plus or minus 0.001 millimeters. American standards allow nearly 127 millimeters. The AI thinks it's compensating for flaws that don't exist, constantly correcting musicians who are already playing perfectly. He reached into a storage cabinet and pulled out a simple metal disc, perforated with tiny calculated holes. The crowd craned their necks to see. A harmonic dampener, Jamal explained. Instead of rewriting millions of lines of code or remanufacturing hardware, we add this to bridge the frequency gap. A $50 part to solve a $67 million problem. Laughter of disbelief mixed with gasps. Victoria stepped forward, her voice sharp. You expect us to believe a janitor's toy can do what elite engineers could not? Jamal didn't flinch. Engines don't lie, he said simply. You just have to listen. He began the installation, his hands moving with precision born not of textbooks, but of years in Detroit garages and sleepless nights studying borrowed manuals. Each turn of the wrench was confident, measured, sure. Rodriguez watched closely, fascinated. Where did you learn resonance engineering? She asked. Jamal tightened the final bolt. My grandfather taught me. He said machines have souls. You can't fix a soul with software. You have to help it find its rhythm. 12 minutes later, the dampener was in place. Jamal stepped back, sweat glistening on his forehead, his eyes steady, ready for testing. The silence was suffocating. 200 employees leaned forward, phones raised. The live stream audience surged into tens of thousands. Mueller checked his watch. 1 hour and 47 minutes remained. Rodriguez nodded once. Start the engine. The ignition key turned with a metallic click. The machine rumbled awake. For 3 seconds, the sound was indistinguishable from before. Then came the pause. The entire room froze. Jamal placed his hand gently on the engine, eyes closed, waiting. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. The harsh knocking that had haunted 6 weeks of failure was gone. In its place came a smooth purr, cylinders firing in perfect synchronization, vibrations melting into harmony. The oscilloscope stabilized into flawless wave patterns. Temperature sensors glowed steady green. The engine had found its voice. The reaction spread like a wave. A single engineer gasped. Another clapped a hand over her mouth. Then the murmurs rose into cheers, applause echoing against the glass walls. Tears welled in eyes that had known nothing but defeat. Even Klaus Mueller's stoic mask cracked into astonishment. Mein Gott, he whispered. The data confirmed it, 97.3% efficiency, 3 points higher than theoretical maximum. Rodriguez circled the diagnostics, her voice reverent. In 40 years of engineering, I've never seen readings this clean. Employees pressed against the windows as the prototype truck outside powered up, headlights blazing to life, navigation systems online for the first time in 6 weeks. The vehicle rolled forward with mechanical grace, executing flawless maneuvers as the engine delivered power like liquid gold. The dreaded shutdown point passed, 14 minutes, then 20, then 30, with no errors. The machine purred on, flawless. Online, the live stream exploded. Comments scrolled too fast to read. Engineers across the globe dissected the discovery in real time. Hashtags trended, #engineering justice, #Jamal Washington. Inside the boardroom, Victoria Sterling's face drained of color. What she had staged as humiliation had transformed into coronation. Jamal Washington, the janitor they had mocked, stood beside the humming engine as if beside an old friend, his hand resting lightly on its surface. For the first time in 6 weeks, the machine wasn't fighting itself, and neither was he. The engine shut down with the satisfied sigh of a machine finally at peace, its diagnostics glowing green like a field of fresh spring grass. For a moment, no one in the boardroom moved. 200 people stood frozen, the silence thicker than steel. The live stream counter ticked upward, past 100,000 viewers, the scrolling comments a blur of celebration and disbelief. Victoria Sterling remained near the windows, her face drained of color, a phone still in her hand capturing what had become her own undoing. Klaus Mueller leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as if weighing the fate of empires. The Germans spoke in hushed, clipped tones, their astonishment barely contained. Dr. Rodriguez closed her notebook with deliberate precision, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. She walked forward, heels tapping against polished floors, and extended her hand to Jamal. That was extraordinary, she said, voice resonant with authority. Your analysis was flawless. Your solution was elegant. In 4 decades of engineering, I've rarely witnessed such intuition. Jamal shook her hand, his calloused fingers meeting the firm grasp of someone who recognized true talent. The employees erupted into applause, some cheering openly, others wiping tears from faces that had only known failure and humiliation for weeks. The wave of sound swelled, bouncing off glass walls until the entire floor vibrated with catharsis. Klaus Mueller rose slowly, every eye turning to him, His words carried the weight of an empire of precision. Herr Washington, your methodology impressed us beyond measure. Our delegation concurs that this was not chance, but brilliance. We are prepared to increase our investment by 20%, contingent on you leading our European engine development program. The room gasped. A janitor had been elevated in a single moment to the architect of an international project. It was a promotion so audacious it almost defied belief, but no one doubted it now. The data spoke louder than prejudice. Dr. Rodriguez addressed the board with crisp authority. Effective immediately, I recommend Mr. Washington be promoted to Senior Diagnostics Engineer, with full compensation and stock options. His insight has saved this company from collapse and secured its future. Applause thundered again, louder this time, echoing beyond the room into the digital world watching live. Hashtags bloomed across social media, journalists crafted headlines in real time. #Jamal Washington trended alongside #engineering justice. In one afternoon, the invisible janitor had become a global symbol of overlooked talent. All eyes turned then to Victoria Sterling. The smile she had worn like armor was gone. Her phone trembled in her hand, the live stream comments no longer mocking Jamal's inevitable failure, but condemning her arrogance. Klaus Mueller's eyes sharpened like a blade. He repeated words she herself had spoken weeks before, the ones she had used to mock Jamal in front of investors. "We believe in giving everyone opportunities, even our janitors," he said, his accent crisp, his tone cutting. "Today, it was precisely your janitor who saved your company. Remember that." The weight of his rebuke landed harder than any financial penalty. Executives shifted in their seats, whispering about leadership credibility, about reputational damage. Board member Patricia Brooks stood, her voice carrying the calm cruelty of corporate justice. "This incident will require immediate review. A senior engineer was relegated to janitorial duties while millions were wasted on consultants. That is unacceptable. Effective immediately, Victoria Sterling will be reassigned as strategic advisor, with a 40% salary reduction and no decision-making authority." The room erupted again, this time with whispers sharp as knives. Victoria staggered, her perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking like armor cracked beyond repair. Her punishment was surgical, no public firing to invite lawsuits, but her empire reduced to rubble nonetheless. And then came the final indignity. Dr. Rodriguez, pen in hand, added with chilling precision, "Given the circumstances, mandatory diversity and inclusion training will be required. I will personally conduct these sessions." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria, who had spent years mocking Jamal as charity, would now sit through lectures on humility delivered by the very woman who had legitimized his genius. The poetic symmetry was not lost on anyone. Jamal stood quietly, his expression calm, his hands still stained with grease. He wasn't gloating. He didn't need to. The engine's purr and the data on the screens were his vindication. He looked toward the employees pressed against the glass, their eyes shining with a mix of relief and pride. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. Outside, the prototype truck continued its flawless run, headlights blazing against the Silicon Valley dusk, a symbol of rebirth. Inside, corporate justice had been delivered, not through courts or lawyers, but through the undeniable power of competence. 6 months later, Jamal's framed community college diploma still hung in his apartment, but beside it were patents, industry awards, and a photograph of him shaking hands with Klaus Mueller at the Munich Auto Show. His mother's treatments were no longer a question of affordability. His grandfather's wisdom had blossomed into a career that spanned continents, and somewhere in the back of a conference room, Victoria Sterling sat quietly with a notepad, forced to listen to lessons she had once sneered at. The live stream that had begun as a stage for humiliation ended as a global parable. Brilliance ignored, justice delayed, respect finally earned. For everyone watching, one truth was inescapable. Sometimes the janitor is the genius. Sometimes the man you step around in silence is the only one who can save you when the machine stops. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.